A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
We're here with C.T. Nguyen. He used to be a food writer and now he's a philosophy professor at the University of Utah who writes about trust, art, games, and communities. He's interested in the ways our social structures and technologies shape how we think and what we value. And today we're going to talk about his book, Games, Agency as Art, and essentially his ideas about gaming and freedom. T, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you argue that games can make us more free. What do you mean by that? How can games make us more free? Specifically, what kind of freedom are you talking about?
This is you're jumping into the deep end. It takes me 4 chapters to get there, man.
If you want to take us on the road to freedom,
let
take us on the road.
Let me take you on the road. You can interrupt me at any point, but it takes a while to get there because the theory is weird.
Okay, we're good for a journey.
So the book project starts a while back when I was trying to teach philosophy of art and wanted to do a case study and whether like games are art, whether video games are art. And I read all this stuff and I remember reading all these books that were like, video games are art because they're a kind of movie or because they're a kind of fiction or because they advance a kind of argument. And they were all trying to talk about how video games were important because they were comparable to some traditional art form. Right. And I read through a lot of these books and they talked about representation and meaning. And the things they didn't talk about were choice, difficulty, skill, like a lot of the things that seemed really distinctive to games.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so a lot of the way that the academic talk happened came apart from the way that game designers, game reviewers, game critics, game fans talked. And so I was trying to capture a lot of that. And one of the really distinctive things that people keep talking about is there are 2 things. One is the way that games make interesting choices or interesting decisions, that they make action seem interesting. Like I think about this a lot because I play a lot of computer games and board games, but also I'm a rock climber, which I also think is a game. And the thing that's interesting about rock climbing is it's not like the climb itself is sometimes the rock the climb is on is beautiful, but sometimes it's just an ugly piece of shit. Like the thing that's interesting when climbers get excited about a climb, it's that the climb makes themselves feel beautiful, right? Like that you're graceful, you're elegant, like you get to move with precision or like when I play chess, what's interesting is like when my mind does something cool, right?
Right.
So this is what I was trying to capture. So one basic idea is, what is a game designer doing when they make a game, right? What are they manipulating, right? One question that I often want to ask is, what's the medium of the art? And if you look at the other stuff, they want to say something like, oh, the medium is stories, or they're digital stories. The medium is visuals and graphics and sound. So one thing that really helped me was Bernard Suitz's book, The Grasshopper. You know this book?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is, you should read this book. This is like the most fun book. It's also probably the best book on the philosophy of games. It's kind of a cult classic. It came out in the 70s and it kind of got lost. Here's his theory. He gives a definition of games in a simple version and a complicated version. The simple version is that to play a game is to voluntarily take on unnecessary obstacles to make possible the activity of struggling to overcome them, right? Voluntarily taking on unnecessary obstacles. I think this is amazing. And he in the more complicated version, what he makes clear is the goal that you're aiming at in a game, I'll give you the technical language, is partially constituted by the constraints. So in other words, what you're trying to do, it doesn't count as doing it unless you did it inside specified constraints. So for example, if you're running a marathon, you're not just trying to get to the finish line, right? You're not just trying to get to that point in space because there are a lot of ways to get there really efficiently. You could get there with an Uber, a bird, steal someone's bike, right? But it doesn't count, right? You have to follow a particular route and do it on your feet. Similarly, like the point of basketball.
All at once.
And all at once.
Right. I could run 26 miles. You have to give me 26 days. Though. Right. Yeah.
Like basketball, the point of basketball is not just to get the ball through the hoop, because you could do that with a stepladder by yourself, right? It's to do it from the ground, facing obstacles. So here's one way to put it. Like, what it is to make a basket is not just to get the ball through the hoop, but to do it obeying various rules, right? What it is to cross the finish line.
So this makes really, so all this focus on games as being about representation, right, things like that, kind of misses the point that games then are really about the choice to take on these obstacles. Yeah,
I mean, so here's the first one way to put it. If you look at Suits, one way to put it is that games are designed obstacles. And in some ways, that's such a more natural way to talk about games for me than talking like the fiction stuff. I mean, games are definitely often fictions, but often they're not. And one of the interesting things you see in the game scholarship research is that the degree to which game players engage with the fictionality is actually really variable. So Jesper Juhl, a really great game scholar, talks about, like, I found he makes a great point that there's a lot of research that shows that, like, if you look at like professional level StarCraft 2 players, they're doing something totally different mentally. Like there's actually like psych studies. So players who play StarCraft 2 for the first time are really engaged with the fiction. They're imagining things. They're like imagining the world. They're imagining the characters. Professional players aren't doing this at all. No. Like they're ignoring the fiction. They're just like playing with the mechanics, like trying to figure out optimum pathways. And if you buy a lot of the fictional theories, then games are at their peak. Like then the professional players are missing the whole point. And that seems really weird to me. So the first pass of this is that, I mean, one way Suits puts it is when we're playing games, we're not taking the most efficient pathway, which means that the goal we're trying to get to in the game isn't actually the point on its own, right? It's a particular sculpted pathway where that pathway has been sculpted partially through constraints. So that's the first step. Like that's part of what they're working with, constraints. Then I read, so Rainer Knizia is one of the great game designers in my book. He's like, he's the Mozart of German board games. He's amazing. And he has this lecture where he says something like,
Andy approves. Andy,
I do approve.
Andy approves. Andy's nodding firmly. You know what I mean? Like if you've played Knizia games, they're so elegant. They're so well designed. They get so much interesting emergent stuff out of a few rules. That's and right. He's nodding vigorously.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he said, the most important tool in my game designer toolkit is the point structure, because the point structure tells the players what to care about. Mm-hmm. And this hit me like as like a bolt, right? Because it's obviously true, right? The rule book tells you what, like, or the game, like they tell you whether you're trying to kill each other or help each other. They tell you whether you're cooperating or competing or cooperating with these people against those people. They tell you whether you're collecting like animals or trying to kill orcs, or like everything you need to know about what you're doing is set by the point system. And if you're a philosopher who works like me in like what our rationality is and what our motivation is and what our agency is, right? Then you're like, holy crap, that's right and really interesting. A game designer does tell you what to care about. And then when you play a game, you just acquire it, right? I mean, literally, I'll sit down with my friends around a table, we'll open up the game, and then we'll find out whether we're trying to, right now there are a lot of interesting cooperative games. We find out whether we're cooperating or whether we're trying to kill each other. And then we just want that for a period of time. And then we step away from it.
That goes back to the magic circle. You step into the magic circle, you accept these things as true, and then you step out when you're done.
Right. So I have complicated views about the magic circle, which we can talk about in a little bit. But this is a specific, I think, like when people talk about, there's this magic circle and then everything on the inside like doesn't matter for things that on the outside, that can't be right. But here's something specific that happens that I think is what a lot of the stuff is getting at. You temporarily take on a goal that you don't actually care about. And this is for me, like this is actually the central idea of my book, that for a lot of us, not all of us, when we enter into a game, we take on a goal that we don't actually galactically care about. So let me give a distinction. So I think that what Suits makes available is that there are two kinds of motivation in play. I'm going to call them achievement play and striving play. So achievement play is playing because you care about winning, and striving play is temporarily taking on an interest in winning for the sake of the struggle. The thing about striving play is you want something else besides winning. You want is fun or relaxation, right? But you can't get that without investing yourself in the win. So during the game, you have to care about winning, but outside of the game, you don't actually care about winning, right? And we can tell, I mean, I think they're both kinds of players, but there are a lot of situations where I think what we're doing is striving play. Like if I introduce a game of charades for fun at a party, and I'm like, this is going to be fun, and then I lose, I'm not like, God damn it, wasted evening, right? What I think is we all had fun, but the only way to have fun is to try hard to win.
And you see within gaming groups, if you have a mismatch of these two things, you have friction in the group, and the group won't work very well.
Though I think it actually depends on game design. So one of the really interesting things is I think a lot of the kind of American hobbyist games I played often depended on a similarity of outlook. Like if everyone was trying really hard to win, then it worked well. But if someone was kind of being like goofy or aimless, it wouldn't work. And a lot of other game designs I've seen have managed to like figure this out and make it possible for some of the players to be differentially motivated and still have a good time together, which I think is super interesting. Yeah. Anyway, so here's
and really hard to do, by the way.
It's really hard to do. So we can talk about this later, but there's a lot of interesting discussion in the role-playing world, especially in building systems that can get people with different gaming motivations to play well together. But it takes a lot of work. Here's an argument that striving play is real. So by the way, I think it's really obvious that it's real. And a lot of people I talk to also do, but a lot of people I talk to are like, this is nuts. This makes no sense. You're just like inventing some bizarre motivational state. So here's an argument.
Okay.
One argument. Let me give you two arguments. One argument. Sometimes I try to win during the game, but I don't actually do the kinds of things that would help me win in the long term. So what I mean is, so a lot of times my wife and I find a board game that we are both really into and that we're balanced at, that we're about equal at. And then at night, I'll find a strategy guide. And I know, right? If I read the strategy guide, I'll win, but also the games will turn boring.
Right.
So because I know my wife will never read the strategy guide, I avoid it too. Right. So if achievement play is the only rational mode of play, what I've done is totally irrational. Right. The only reason to play for an achievement player is to win. Right. But if you think that winning is just the desire to win is just a temporarily thing I take on to have the fun of the struggle, then it makes total sense for you to be like, no, right? Don't increase your skill. Keep your skill at the right level to have these juicy, tasty struggles. So I think in that state, I have to be a striving player.
And that takes place outside of this magic circle, which is your point about the magic circle. The magic circle is pretty porous. Okay,
here's one more argument for striving play. Consider the category of stupid games. A stupid game is a game. Sorry, this is a category I made up. I'm really proud of this. This is my proudest baby. A stupid game is a game where the fun part is failing, but you have to try to win to have fun, like Twister or drinking games, right?
Mm-hmm. All right.
So you can't actually, in Twister, you can't intend to fall. That's not funny, right? It's only funny if you're trying not to fall. So here's the weird thing about Twister. You want the hilarity of falling, but it's only hilarious if you actually get yourself to genuinely want and aim at succeeding, so the failure is real and it's funny.
Right. So that's a difficulty challenge for the game designer to make the game more difficult than it ought to be so that players will have more fun failing.
I mean, it's not even, I think this little thing isn't a difficulty for the game designer, because I think we all can just do this. This is a capacity that almost all of us have. We can just, the game designer often can just rely on the fact that we can pick up a game and be like, okay, well, the funny part's going to be failing, but I'm just going to try. Like most of us have just learned to do this.
Right.
So, I mean, I think this really teaches us something about us. But that's not what you care about here.
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
So,
but it's fascinating. I actually do care a lot about that. So.
Right.
As a game designer, Andy's like, the challenge is still making it the situation so they fail, and so that the task for failure is the right kind of difficulty. Right. And it's an interesting failure, et cetera, et cetera.
And creating a game that communicates that to the players so that they know that when they're getting into it, they have to go into it with that mindset.
Right. Yes. So I mean, I think all of those things are challenges for the game designer. Getting the difficulty right to make it funny, to making it so that people aren't so invested that they get angry at losing. That's all the challenge. But the fact that we can just take on an interest in winning, that's what most people who've learned to play games can just do. And they can, it's like a background fact that game designers rely on. Okay. So you put this all together. So here's the general idea. What is a game designer actually doing? They're not just designing a story or a world or graphics. They're telling us what our abilities are, what our challenges are, and what we want. They're specifying the world we're against, but they're also specifying the kind of agent we are. They're telling us what our agency is in its core during the game.
Right.
And then we can just open the rules and enter in. Like most of us have the ability to just take on that agency. To answer Andy's really interesting question, I think what the game designer's tools, the background for the game designer is the fact that most of us can just take on an agency, though some agencies are hard to take on. What the game designer's challenge is manipulating the designed agency and the world it faces to make challenges that are interesting, tasty, fun, whatever, right? All that stuff. So, basic theories, part A. The medium of the game designer is agency itself.
Okay, so let's pause.
Yes.
Right. Obviously, agency has a bunch of things built into it here. Right. So when you say, right, as a player, you essentially step into an agency, right? What exactly are you stepping into? Are you stepping into a complex of motivation, desires, goals? Is that essentially essentially what you mean, that you're adopting that particular? Normally we talk about agency, we talk about your ability to do what you want.
Yeah.
Right. But to do what you want to do, you need to have things that you want to do.
Right.
Right.
So in some sense, so I'm using agency in maybe a slightly technical way. So what an agent is in my mind is some set of abilities and goals or values that generate reasons for action. So this is like, this means this is why people will talk about, I'm sending my lawyer as my agent, or they talk about corporate agents. So the IRS is supposed to be an agent, or search engines are supposed to be agents, right? And what that means is they have a goal and they have methods, and they try to reach that goal using those methods. So that's what I mean by an agency. So answering your question, it's a really interesting question. So it's not like the game designer is specifying a full self, because a game player is going to bring in they're going to bring in their style, their personality, their interests, their abilities. But the game designer is designing like what I want to call like an agential skeleton. They're telling you your core basic motivation, and they're specifying the abilities that you're allowed to use in the game.
Let's before we move on, can we apply this, let's say, to 3 very different genre video games,
right,
to see how this would work?
Okay, so here's some examples. So the computer game Civilization, which I'm never allowed to touch again because it's addictive.
You too, huh?
Yeah,
that's
right.
That's you know. See, I have a whole history with Civilization. Right. It's my favorite game ever. I have bought it and thrown it away many times throughout my life.
Well, I knew in my childhood when I was rummaging through the garbage dumpster in my back of my apartment to find the CD-ROM that I'd thrown away in a fit of frustration that I had a problem.
That is
right.
Yeah. So
Civilization. Okay.
So Civilization specifies a set of goals. Like there's a number of goals, like space victory, right? Like, I mean, it changes a little bit, but like, convert everyone to your culture. So there are a set of goals that you're aiming at, and then it's like a really large set of abilities. And the abilities here are, basically colonize stuff, grow stuff, invent tech trees. So you use those abilities and those goals, and you face the obstacles of the game, which in this case are bear survival, and then the other civilizations trying to race you. There's one ability. Here's another one.
So you also listed values. So let's. Right. So the goals and values, are they separate, or are they?
So in this case, what counts as your values in the game are specified goals.
Okay.
Although I think you can bring in other ones, and this is something that's really interesting. So when I think it's interesting that in many games, a lot of us want to play in a cool way, right? And that's something that we often bring. And there are. I mean, let me give you some video game examples, and then I'll. So So, I mean, actually, so in rock climbing, the goal is to get to the top, and the abilities you're allowed to use are your hands and your feet on rock. And that's it. You're not allowed to use gear or anything else to advance up the rock. The gear is just for safety. So there's a specified goal, which is getting up the rock, specified abilities. And then I think some of us also import other values. So some people will just get up the rock by any means necessary. Other people are like, no, I want to climb in a pretty way. Like it, or right. I want to do it in, so, and for me, it's often like, I would rather take the cool, clever solution that makes it less powerful than to just do the raw power solution, right? So, but that's a little bit of style I import into the basic agential framework of the game that we all take on, which is let's get to the top of the rock using our hands and feet. And that sets most of the parameters. And then I get to import a little sort of style. So you want other examples. So Super Mario Brothers, the goal, I mean, it's kind of funky because there are, there are a few different goals on offer. One goal is just to get to the end of the game. Another goal is to get as many points as possible, right? So some people, I think, just take on the goal, get to the end of the game. Other people take on the goal. So there are a few different games you could play with the same thing, but there's basically a specified agency. Most of us, when we played it, kind of took on the two goals together. We tried to get through the game while getting as many points as possible. And then the game, and I think Super Mario is a great example because the game gives you abilities, running, jumping, and then it gives you a world full of things to run past and jump over. And there it is. And I think it's interesting. You can see right there the kind of, so in the book, I call it like practical harmony. The game is giving you this experience where your abilities fit the world. And I think one of the nice things about games, one of the pleasures of them and one of the seductive dangers is that in games we fit. Like in normal life, a lot of the times the things we need to do are either so boring and beneath our abilities, but we have to do them every anyway, like folding the laundry or grading, or vast and overwhelming. But in games, the affordances is a technical term. The abilities you're given, running and jumping, are just enough to beat the challenges. And depending on your skill level, you can scale the difficulty by adjusting the difficulty setting, picking the game or picking the opponent until the challenge is just right. So games are these sculpted experiences of pleasurable or wonderful or satisfying or interesting action that have been sculpted by the game designer sculpting an agency and then sculpting a world.
Great, right? Andy, you looked like you wanted to say something to this before.
Just that it connects very neatly in with the idea of flow, right? Where flow is that you get in that flow state when you are in that space where your skill level and the difficulty level of the thing you're doing is just right. And you can get in that flow state, and our brains really love that flow state. And our brains love to get in that flow state and stay there for as long as they can.
By the way, Andy, did you say that you're a game designer?
I am, yeah.
What kind of games?
Well, I design board games and card games and video games, and most of my money in the last 20 years or so has come from mobile games, or 15 years, I guess. But before that, I worked for Sony PlayStation and Sega, and I teach game design at New York Film Academy, where Shlomo teaches ethics in game design.
Awesome. I mean, it might be interesting to you. University of Utah, I'm sure you know, has a big game design program, and I'm co-teaching in it with a game design professor right now, Jose Zagal. And I mean,
you know, our episode with Jose is out right now.
Right, we've had two episodes with him.
Yeah. Two episodes.
The second one is out.
Yeah, is out. That's a current episode. Yeah.
Our game design class is actually like, so he teaches a game ethics class, but our class is about aesthetics and play, and a lot of it is about giving like aesthetic theories and then like goofy indie games to our students and like challenging them to like, one of our first assignments was design a game that conveys the exhaustion of being a student during COVID. And
nice.
But yeah, so I think one of the things, I'm hoping this will sound familiar to you, because one of the places this theory came from was reading a lot of academic work that didn't seem to match at all, and finding in game designer dev blogs, like forums, like I spent a lot of time on Board Game Geek, like a lot of discussion by people that really seemed to track what I cared about. And so this book is in some sense me trying to give a theory, like an aesthetic theory as a philosopher of art that matches how the game designers talk and how like the critics on Board Game Geek talk.
Right, as opposed to the official critics that we read in the newspapers or magazines, and they don't necessarily talk the same way.
I think actually the official critics do often talk this way, and but the thing that in the background, one of the things this comes from is I keep seeing a tendency both among critics and game designers of, I don't know, being anxious about whether games are art and then trying to make them more like art by making them more like movies, which often involves fixed scripts, spending a lot more time, and people who say like, oh, this is really an art game, and they point to the graphics and the sound, where I'm like, no, if you want to get excited about this stuff, you should look at like these like incredible mechanical innovations coming out of people like Knizia in the indie RPG world. And like the thing that I can now say is what their innovations is their innovations in agency design. They're like new, interesting, fascinating ways that game designers are playing with the medium of agency to get us new kinds of activity. And that's the stuff that I'm really excited by. We're
giving players agency over things that they didn't used to have agency over. Like you've been paying attention to the RPG world, so you know, our role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, but ones that give players agency over how the story goes, or they can take control of the narrative from the GM for a period, or maybe there's no GM at all and everybody's just sharing that, and they're fascinating.
This is all the stuff that I'm playing right now. Like this, the world of this stuff is so. For example, the thing that apparently blew my students' mind the most was we had them play The Quiet Year, which is this amazing tabletop role-playing game where you and 2 or 3 other people are kind of like the gods overseeing a village for a year of the apocalypse. And it's a collective map-making game where you create the challenges that face the villagers and help them move past it by drawing on a map together. And like it's like sad and weird and evocative. And I mean, but this is exactly right. So my favorite example of this is, do you know the RPG Blades in the Dark?
I've heard of it. I haven't looked at it yet.
So here's this incredible mechanical innovation in agency design. So the game it's a fantasy world. You're all like, it's full of wizards and powerful armies and generals. You're not them. You're the cons and thieves trying to steal from them. And the way the game works is, so you will decide, oh, I'm going to break into this wizard's vault and steal his fucking potions or whatever, right? And the players skip immediately from deciding to do that to breaking in. They skip over like a month of time. The characters have planned, but the players haven't. Okay. So then the players start with stamina points. And as you face challenges, you spend your stamina points to have Ocean's 11 style flashbacks where you play out what you did in the past to prepare for this very moment.
Yeah.
Nice. So like someone can throw you off a building and it like does this power differential. So some wizard fireballs you off a building. You're weak, but you can have a flashback to when you paid the street urchins to put down a net, right? And so like that's a totally new way of interacting with a narrative, right? That's a rule set that creates a new relationship to time and stories that I've never seen before. It's amazing.
All right. I'm gonna move you back from aesthetics to ethics.
Okay.
Because it's hard. Because I want to chat about this stuff.
You think it's different? Right?
Well, yeah, to an extent. Yeah, okay, sure. Fine. I mean, you know, some of the stuff we could talk about, you know, simply about, you know, advancing the art form, etc. And, you know, when you talk about bringing your aesthetic values, right, also to a game, that part is going to affect your agency, right. and that's really, really cool. But let's talk about, so we're going back to the idea that games essentially are a place that place you in a position of agency, right? And place you in the context of agency, and also, if done well, right, make that agency really, really fit well.
Right. Can I just say one little thing?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that games necessarily work by giving you more agency. Often they're interesting because they give you less agency. So I think here of games like Hold'em Poker and a lot of Knizia designs, which are delicious just because you get like, there are a lot of poker-like games Knizia has where you just get like one ability. There are only two things you can do. Or I think about the game Portal, which is amazing because you only have like this one. You can't do all the other stuff you can do at other video games. You have to do everything with this one ability, and that narrowness of agency is often really wonderful. Anyway, but yeah, ethics, freedom.
I'm trying to stay on brand here.
Okay, let's stay on brand. Stay the course. Stay on mission. No mission drift.
We've got everything focused on understanding games as agency. And I'm trying to figure out how that extends either to the way that, either to the ethics of how games treat us.
Right.
Maybe we should start there. Kind of start with the, it's not often in our lives that we're put into a position where our agency is respected.
Right.
We're thrown into this world where very often we have so little control over the kind of things that we do. Are games giving us, in some sense, more agency than the rest of the world in a way that is more respectful of us? Or, notice I'm throwing a question at you that is loaded, and I'm hoping for you to pick it up as loaded.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, this idea of being more respectful. I really want to see what you mean, because that's not an idea I've had. The way I put it is, part of the deliciousness of games is you get a kind of usually delightful agency where you have the ability to do what you want. Of course, there are really interesting, like arty games that give you the experience of terror or suffocation, like as I'm sure a lot of people know about Papers, Please, games like this. Lots of role-playing games I go play where they're trying to express and let you have an experience of what it's like to be someone with no agency, and then using game design tools to give you this too. But I think the reasons a lot of us do play a lot of games is precisely because, I don't know, in our life we have insufficient agency, and here's a world where we get to do where we get to actually act and succeed because the world has been designed. And it's not just that, it's that I think one of the interesting things is that in normal life, our goals are so fuzzy and unclear and plural, and games give us this like blessed value clarity. I kind of think they're an existential balm where you know exactly what you're doing. You know exactly how well you've done. You get ranked.
Right. I think that's super important too, and we haven't talked about that, which is the feedback that you get from games tells you how well you're doing.
Right.
Even when you're rock climbing, your height is basically your achievement meter.
Right.
Right. You're halfway up the hill. You're halfway up the rock. So with games, you get this, a good game, I should say, you get this feedback. Poor games don't do it very well and suffer.
Right. This idea, I've always thought about it as, they make your life feel like it's meaningful. Right. And I've thought this a lot about Civilization, in particular, because it was a game that over and over when my life was confusing and when it just seemed so hard, I could play a game like Civilization. I had very clear-cut goals and all my actions made sense. But at this, and of course, it's interesting with a game like Papers, Please. For our audience, Papers, Please, super, super interesting game where essentially you play a border control official. And it's interesting because your agency there is actually very, very limited. There's people that you're like in Eastern Europe kind of country in the 80s, let's say early 80s, and you need to let people into your country or not let people into your country. And it's an authoritarian country, and your family is desperate for the things that you can bring. And your choice is to stamp a passport is yes or no, for the most part, right? And the people who are coming to you have even less agency than you do. And yet, through putting you in this experience of having this very restricted agency, and it's interesting, right? In the cases of Paper, Please, I don't feel like, I feel like my life is tragic, right? If I play Papers, Please, right? Not really meaningful. It's more like a real learning experience for me. And that seems like a very different kind of, in terms of what I'm getting.
You feel like your life is meaningful in the game, but you feel like the game itself is very meaningful, which is like a strange dichotomy too.
With a game like Papers, Please, I definitely don't feel like my life is meaningful in the game because it's just it's so restricted.
Right.
And it really is the kind of experience, and I think everybody should play Papers, Please. I'm an immigrant, I think of immigration, right? Very, very much so, right? And I think it's one of those situations where a lot of your forced learning. I think about games that really restrict your freedom, like This War of Mine. Is going to be another one that, and even let's say that the last scene of The Last of Us, right? For those of you who played The Last of Us, right? They take away your agency in the last scene. So the way the game ends, it ends with a cutscene where you're being asked a question and you can't answer it. The cutscene answers for you, and it answers with a lie, right? And in all these kind of situations, it seems that they take away your agency and they use it to create a sort of experience for you that is supposed to be a meaningful kind of experience, even though the meaning doesn't come from your ability to actually, do the things that you wanted to do.
I mean, before I do the ethics chart, I just want to say, I think there are a lot of accounts of this is one last bit of aesthetics. I think there are a lot of accounts of the art that try to find for a given art form its value. And I think you can't do that. That the art form can be used for all kinds of purposes. The thing I'm trying to say is not that the point of games is to give you a feeling of more agency. The thing I'm trying to say is what the game designer is doing is manipulating agency for all kinds of different effects. Sometimes those effects come from giving you more agency. Sometimes those come from removing it to give you a different kind of experience. And the medium has all kinds of potential, but that's what the medium is. The stuff about freedom is super interesting. So let me start at the back and then move to the front. So one of my worries about games, so a lot of people we know are worried that video games engender violence and all this stuff. And I think there's a lot of evidence that for the most part, for people with a healthy understanding of what fantasy is, they don't. The thing that I'm actually worried about is that exposure to games might get you used to this value clarity and make you expect clear, quantified, simple values outside in life and be drawn to institutions and practices that give you clear, quantified, externalized expressions of value. So the slogan from the end of the book is, I'm not worried that games are going to make serial killers. I'm worried they're going to make Wall Street bankers. And this, by the way, is an empirical claim that I'm trying to get people to test, but it's really funky that people haven't tested this. So let me back up a bit. One, I think that games have an incredible promise and incredible danger that both come from the way they use the agential medium. So here's the promise, and I can now finally answer your opening question about games.
All right, we got to it.
Here we are. I mean, it takes a while. This is chapter 4. Literally, like, it takes me 120 pages in the book to get to this point. So games manipulate agency. This also means for me that games are a storage vessel for different forms of agency, right? A game designer can sculpt a mode of agency, and then you can experience it and learn to occupy it. So I literally think I learned to do analytic philosophy from chess. Like, I was bad at looking ahead to see what my opponent would, like an opponent would say in philosophy, and I learned that mental mode from chess. So all kinds of games encode different like kind of mental modes. Some are about deceit and manipulation. Some are about running and jumping. Some are about reflexes. Like philosophy, rock climbing made me a much more graceful person by making me concentrate on precise issues of balance, by taking away all my other affordances and saying all you have is your hands and your feet and tiny, tiny things to balance on, right? So here's a thought. Every medium is a storage library for a different kind of information. Books can encode stories and argument and data. Pictures can encode visual information. Games encode forms of agency. So games are a library of agency. And when you play lots of them and reflect on them, you can actually learn different modes of agency and expand your repertoire. This is the way that games make us more free, I think. I mean, literal example, I play a lot of conniving, manipulative social games, and I literally use that mode that I learned from those games in committee meetings when like the business school is trying to defund the philosophy department and I need to be an aggressive manipulator. I have learned how to like shift people's incentives and represent incentives differently from games, and I can just use that, right?
I've often felt that playing different characters in role-playing games allows you to basically put on these different hats,
right?
These different value hats. Like, oh, I'm going to play this kind of character now and see how that feels.
But in some ways, I feel like, how about this? I think that's true, but I also think what's going on in role-playing games there is really interesting, but it's a little more familiar because that's what happens. It's closer to the kind of characters we pick up in fiction. Right. But the fact that you just plunged into a manipulative agency or plunged into a geometric agency, I mean, here's something.
Management.
Yes, resource management
is a huge one, right?
Right.
You take on the whole thinking of the world in terms of resource management.
Have you ever had the experience, by the way, of trying to put too much furniture in a moving van and your brain's just doing it and you realize, oh, I was trained to do this by Tetris. That's why I can just do this now.
I actually loaded moving vans for my dad before Tetris came out. I actually worked doing that when I was a teenager. Right. But yeah, this idea of like learning how things fit. And this is, so it's interesting. And I think some of this really takes a little bit of stepping back for a second to kind of get into both the positives and the dangers are really interesting. So let's get into the positives, and then positives, right, is I can experience lots and lots of different kinds of agencies, right? And potentially even, and I can learn from those agencies. I can take those agencies, use them in my real life. I can acquire skills of agency, which is weird to kind of talk about skills of agency,
right?
Because on the one hand, your agency should just be connected to here's what I want,
right?
But in games, you're put into artificial conditions that say if you wanted something under certain conditions, here's the ways that you can fulfill those conditions.
Can I say just something really briefly? So here's the interesting thing for me about thinking about games as storehouses of agency rather than skill is the difference is that skill is just the ability to do something, and agency for me is the skill and the affordances paired with a goal or a value. So it's not just, when you play a game, you don't just learn the skill, you learn the skill inside the experience of being super focused on manipulation or super focused on optimizing something, or right. And I think the quickest answer to your question is this is freeing when you get kind of reflective control over it and realize, oh, here's what it's like to be hyper optimizing about resources. And I can use that sometimes. When is it relevant? I can put that hat on. It's bad when you're just stuck in that forever and you spend your entire life resource optimizing because that's the agency that you're stuck in. So basically, the promise and the perils of games offer you these little shaped agencies. If you learn lots of them and expand your inventory and learn to like move between them and control them as when appropriate, that's freeing. If you just get stuck in resource management mode and the world just becomes resources to optimize just because you're stuck in that agency, that's undermining. And I think it should be completely unsurprising that if we understand how a medium works, we will see a paired promise and ethical danger, right? Fiction is valuable because it can teach us what it's like to emotionally be another person. And it's terrifying if it can infect us with like a fascistic attitude and emotions, and we get stuck like that. Same thing with games.
That's amazing.
That's super, super interesting. I love this. And I'm thinking now of your stockbroker example.
Yeah.
All right. Because
there are worse examples in stockbroker or
yes,
banker, right? I mean, way worse examples that you could use.
Though I should say, you might want to, it's easier for people in maybe our world to like spit on like being stuck in the hyper quantitative world of being a stockbroker, or so I'm working on a paper with Olufemi Taiwo right now about how this attitude infects both wartime generals and pickup artists, which are also like these like very dangerous. Right. But also I think like I don't know
people.
But it's academics get stuck on citation rights and the rankings of the journals they publish in, journalists get stuck on page views. Like that's there's something to talk about at the end, which is I think the games theory helps us understand the infectiousness of these kinds of metrics, but also the specific thing, the worry where playing games might prime you to go looking through the world to highly metrified environments where you can just be like, okay, here's the value system. I can just take it up.
Right.
Right.
I mean, you could take it as far as going capitalism. Capitalism has a highly metricized value system, right?
100%. The biggest danger of games is getting stuck in the mode of I'm allowed to instrumentalize everything as long as it increases its point score.
Right.
And that just means whatever real life system you're in, as long as you can superimpose value clarity on it and have identified the goals that you're supposed to have in some sort of context. And this is
and that's the ethical problem, right? That's the ethical danger.
Yes, and again, the danger is getting stuck in it, right? And treating others as being stuck in it, or
I mean, I think people think I'm downplaying the danger of games, or when they think that I'm not too worried about graphical violence. I feel like I'm upplaying the danger of games. Like what's dangerous is it'll make people that are hyper focused on maximizing some single quantity and ignoring everything else in the world. That I think is actually, if you look at the world we're in, that is a far worse danger than serial killers.
So it's made me think about Brenda Romero Nee Brathwaite's Train game. She makes these. Yep. She's a game designer. She's been a game designer for a very long time, video game designer. But she's also over the last 10 years, 15 years now, made these art games, and they're one-off tabletop games. And Train is a game about loading little meeple, little game pieces onto train cars. Yep. In an efficient way, and it's presented. The board game itself is this beautiful thing where it's presented on broken glass, like a shattered window pane, with these train tracks going across it, and people see it and go, oh, it's they get it, right? They get the symbology first, but if you play it, it's not what you think it is. Because what she does is she has played with this idea that you're talking about with agency by making the rules not clear. So you have to decide, like, your goal is to load these people as efficiently as possible onto these trains. But she doesn't really give you a super clear idea about how to do that. So you have to decide, which makes you then implicit in the act of doing this thing. And it's super interesting. And she's done a bunch of these other games on it too. But the idea of like making you decide how to do the game is the key to that game. The key that makes it, that turns it into like this art project as opposed to like a publishable board game.
I want to kind of go two ways on this. One is really interesting because if this is a tendency that games can have on people, and especially I think of leaderboards and the competitive nature of leaderboards and that comparison to capitalism, right? And winning at the competition seems to be a really big one, but also this idea of just getting stuck in a loop where you're promoting one value. It seems to me that it creates a special space for games to do what Train does, right? Mm-hmm. To kind of get you into a mode where you're doing something, and I'm thinking of something as old as like Shadow of the Colossi, right? Where you're doing something, and then the game gets you to question, really, why am I doing this, right?
Right. In Shadow of the Colossi, just to give a little background for our listeners, you play a kid in this big fantasy world. You're pretty much alone except for your horse, except for these giant, beautiful monsters that your goal is to kill. I had to stop playing. I killed like 2 monsters, and I'm like, no, I'm not doing this anymore.
but you're doing it to essentially revive the princess whose life you're saving by killing all these, right? And this is it's the kind of game where as you keep playing, the game kind of drops hints that gets you to question whether your laser narrow focus on just reviving this princess, right, is the right thing to do. And I think there's a number of games, right, that kind of do this, which is itself speaking to the hopefully power of games to also, like every other art form, question and the effects the art form might have.
One of the papers from which I took the most inspiration especially for the final third of my book, which is about this stuff, is a wonderful paper from Miguel Sicart called "On the Banality of Virtual Evil." Okay. And it basically argues, it was a criticism particularly aimed at at the BioWare RPGs I grew up playing, like Knights of the Old Republic. And he was saying, like, look, so people had this response where they're like, oh, Grand Theft Auto is evil. We need to build morality systems into our games. And the morality systems they built were really simple ones where you're given these options, like kick the dog, save the dog. And you got either the moral points or evil points. And his critique is that companies like BioWare thought they were doing good by introducing morality into the system. And he thought they were actually corroding morality by giving a presentation of morality as simple, easy, obvious, and simply quantitative. And he thought it was much better. He actually thought Grand Theft Auto and games like that are much better because they ask you to do these difficult things and they just leave it up to you to reflect on their meaning. And this is where, for me, the aesthetics and the ethics collide again. Because I think, so the way that I'm really worried about people taking games is just being in a setting where you have a single point system and value and you just export that unthinkingly. The way that I'm hoping people play games, the path towards this freedom thing, is when you play a game, you bury yourself in this narrow, simple point system, and then you step back from it and you reflect, was this worth it? Was this worthwhile? And I think the aesthetic impulse is actually one of the best impulses here, because the aesthetic impulse is, by its nature, not rule-driven, not point-driven, right? You step back, you have this rule-driven, point-driven thing, and you step back and then you ask, was it fun? Was it rich? Was it interesting? Was it worthwhile? So in my part of philosophy of art, one of the basic views that I really find fascinating and really plausible is that aesthetic judgments are not rule-driven. They're not principle-driven. They always proceed from some complex, open-ended taste. And so if you play games aesthetically, and a lot of them, you're constantly moving into point systems and then out of them and reflecting on them on their worthwhileness from some non-hyper explicit point-driven system. So this, for me, like, that's the hope for me, that this kind of like the playful aesthetic attitude towards games is one that encourages constant stepping back from and reflection on these narrowed systems, and that could be really valuable for us, because all the times in our lives we do have to plunge into these narrowed consciousnesses and these narrowed goals, but then we have to pull ourselves back.
Right. To me, it's interesting because, on the one hand, I'm super attracted to value clarity in games, because life is so, I'm an ethicist. I was interested in ethics because life is so fucking confusing. Life is still fucking confusing, right? Games don't give you less confusing. But who had value clarity? Hitler, right? It's value clarity scares me. When I teach contemporary moral issues, it's the people who I'm trying to change are the people who are really dogmatic in their beliefs, who are really certain about their beliefs. And this is the kind of thing where in my class, in my ethics of video games class, one of the things that we talk about is kind of like this. I think games like, and this is why I think games like This War of Mine or Papers, Please are kind of so important. And so because they in some sense challenge this value clarity you can have. But a game like This War of Mine, which is where it's a very, very, I think we've talked about in the show before, it's a very hard game. It's a very sad game. And it's the kind of game that really should ask you the question, why am I playing this game? And to me, the question of why am I playing this game? Why should I play this game is very similar to, it's an existential question, right? It's a question of how I should live my life. It's a question of what are the kind of things that I should really, do with myself.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting thing for me is I think Bernard Suits, this book that inspired all the stuff I've been doing, The Grasshopper. I think it's an existential work, and I think it's an existential work. The argument at the end of the book is this quirky argument where he says that in utopia, if we've solved all our practical problems, all we have to do with our life is play games. So games must be the purpose of life. And I really do think for me, struggling, I mean, to some people, it's a weird place for a philosopher who started in ethics to work on games. But I think for me, it is really a question. Thinking about games and play and art is really a way to think about the meaning of life and the value of activities and why we do this weird stuff. And I think I just want to emphasize, we're going to talk a lot about the instrumental uses of games, whether they can train us or develop us. But I also think it's just like aesthetically rich games are just valuable in and of themselves. That's just a worthwhile way.
Yeah.
And part of the reason to argue that they're an art form is just to say, no, it's not a waste of time. Even if you don't get any other thing out of it, it's beautiful. But
Beauty itself is valuable.
But I just want to say about about what Shlomo was saying. I've been working. So I have two streams of research. One is in philosophy of art, and the other is in social epistemology about the social nature of knowing. And there I've been working on social media and conspiracy theories and echo chambers, and those have collided. And we might be interested. So this is the next book I've been working on, but I have a paper that's just come out called The Seductions of Clarity about how you design fake clear systems that get people to stop thinking. And the two examples are conspiracy theories and metrified bureaucratic justification systems. And so I think there's something about the crisp clarity of like a QAnon type, like, here's how we explain the world all in one, and the kind of metrified, gamified environment we find in bureaucracies where it all turns out to, we need to justify things in sort of clicks or profits or, in the case of some of the universities we're involved in, like student graduation rate, that has the same like compellingness. So I think these are often understood as giving you the value of a game, but not in the kind of secluded magic circle of play, but on like education in Twitter, right? Where having a simplified value is actually really corrosive.
And it's the sort of meat that when people want to gamify things,
right?
This is what they're really trying to do.
Yes, this is this other paper this is the stuff. So the games book is mostly a love song about games, and this is the last chapter about maybe we should worry about gamification. And everything I've been doing since then is trying to work out that last thing. And there's a paper you might be interested in. The other thing of mine that just came out. It's called How Twitter Gamifies Communication. And it's specifically using the games model to say, okay, here's what Twitter's doing. Twitter is offering you the pleasure of points advancement. And all you have to do to get that pleasure and get the gaming pleasure is to buy in to, as a value system, the point system as Twitter measures it. But there are lots of rich values for communication that aren't in that. Right. It's just measuring short-term popularity.
Yeah, and this is the short-term popularity and the financial rewards which come with that. Yeah. This is where gamification gets scary for me. Yeah. Right, with the idea that you really have the same, the same motivators for agency, right? You're being told that the rewards are to get those likes, to get those clicks, and the rewards are also the financial rewards, right, that come with that. And I'm thinking of your Super Mario Brothers example, where you need to get to the end and get the score, and both of the kind of rewards that we can get, social and financial ones, right, are both seeming to be connected in a place like this. And the influencer, as the special new type of person of our time, I don't know if that's true or not. In some sense, there's always been influencer, but influencers that are quantified influencers, right? That's what gives them their special superpower, right? That they've managed in this game that's got set up to essentially be on the leaderboard.
Right. And,
that does scare me.
Yeah.
But what's nice about, though, this argument is that the solution is also clear, right? Play more games, because the more, no, I mean, I say that glibly, but But seriously, the more games you play, the more likely you are to have to think, oh, what's different about this game than the last game? And then that is the way that you lead people to think about how are value systems different? How is this value system different? How is this goal system different? How is this actually applicable to things outside of the game?
Or I want to twist that, Andy. I mean, I don't, if I play, Call of Duty, and then play another shooter, play another shooter.
Right. So
right?
different kinds of games. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So you're putting yourself into different value systems.
This is exactly the conclusion of the book.
Oh.
I was like, look, what you should do. So it's not just play games, it's play more games, play a greater diversity of games, and be involved in the process of critical reflection and aesthetic reflection on the value, the differential value. Be aware of what the different value of being involved in different point systems is. Like, don't just take on point systems unthinkingly. Understand the form of life they bring to you, and ask yourself whether it's worth it or not. And that's, that's the inoculant against just being sucked into.
That's great. I want to add to that I'm thinking about what this means for game designers too, right? And, game designer obviously can't make you play a lot of games, but at least game designers can ensure that some of these games can be tools for reflection, that some of these games are, pieces of art that reflect on the art form.
Sure. And we can do that and some games already do this by giving you different roles to play within the game that have different win conditions and have different metrics for winning. So you have these competing metric systems within the same game, which are really interesting.
Yeah, actually,
right.
The games book got held up because I'd sent the manuscript off to my publisher, and then I played Cole Werrell's game Root, which is an extraordinary game that does exactly this, where every different person playing it plays from in my language, a gentle position. They have different goals, different mechanics, and then you get to play the game from each of these different perspectives. And I think so I ended up rejiggering a chapter of the book around this, and it's exactly that. Like, the game forces you as part of its basic play to change perspectives when you change roles, and that builds in a kind of reflectiveness, which I think is just genius.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's a good point to end.
It's
right?
It's a perfect ending point. I've got so many notes from this one. Things to read, things to do. This has been a really great episode.
CT Nguyen, thank you very much for being a guest. We're hoping to have you again. You were really, really wonderful. All right. Play nice, everybody.